Okay, hi everybody. I like to make a video after every exam. Um, Sort of review grading, talk about trends and so on. This was the first full-size exam. So I also have a few things to tell you in general about how grading is calculated, how to take free response questions. Um, so let's talk about that. I'm assuming you've already seen your scores in Neo. If not, please go back and check those before you continue this video. Um, I have to say, most importantly, this was a really solid exam. Like, students did really well. By every measure, students in this term did better than students in the previous term. Um, the curve was higher, the average was higher, the low score was higher, there were fewer low scores, there were higher high scores and more high scores. More students did well relative to the curve. So instead of like a D heavy curve, it was a B heavy curve. And I was really pleasantly surprised and encouraged. We have a number of systems that check for cheating, and a couple of students had answers which triggered our cheating sensors, but I don't think those were real concern. I'm going to keep an eye on that, but overall, it also looked like there was little or no cheating, and that's encouraging. And I'm really, really happy by how well everyone formatted their exams. I guess I'm getting better at explaining, maybe, but answers were brief and direct. I had very few rambling essays. Almost everybody divided their answers and almost everybody labeled them A, B, C, D. Almost everybody answered in full sentences. That was really, really encouraging. Maybe you're one of the kids who didn't, no big deal. We'll just, practice. But I'm really, really encouraged. This was a really satisfying experience. Usually I hate grading because it's kind of depressing, and I was not depressed. Thanks. Number two, remember to please ignore the multiple choice and the free response scores. I got to write them in the grade book for record keeping, so all my other stuff's in the grade book. I might just start hiding those. The reason you can see them is in case I make a mistake, I'd like you to catch it. So you look in the free response and you're like, hey, I got 7 points correct and you only gave me a 4. I'll be like, oh, my bad. I want you to see the scores so you can catch my mistakes, but please ignore the denominator. So you'll have a 7 out of 10 or a 7 out of 500 or a 7 out of 20,000. And everybody's like, oh, I got an F. The denominator is not relevant. That doesn't calculate into your grade. There's categories. I use weighted averages in this class. And a lot of the record keeping is not in one of those categories. So the denominator doesn't matter. You can ignore the denominator. The only score that matters, that factors into your grade, is the total. And the total is calculated by adding your multiple choice and double your free response. So if you've got like a 10 in the multiple choice and a 5 on the free response, your score would be a 20, because 10 plus 2 times 5 is 10 is 20. And then we divide that by the curve to get your percentage score. The curve is right around the 90th percentile. So I take the 10% of kids that are most shockingly good and I throw those out. And we set the curve at around the 90th percentile. In a class with 20 students, we throw out the top 2. In a class with 30 students, we throw out the top 3, something like that. The curves this time were a 23 for period 1 and a 27 for period 2. Period 1 usually has a lower curve because kids are sleepier. in period 1. So there's more students who miss some content and more students who do badly on the exam because they're sleeping in. Man, I blew it. I gave away an answer this time. Some of you noticed that question B gave the answer to question A1. That rarely happens. That was a clumsy last minute change. I have a couple of quick corrections. So in the food web free response thing, first of all, I gave away the answer to A1. But a lot of kids got that one wrong, even though they knew the right content because they didn't answer in full sentences. Also, that was a problem for number 2. When they ask you for a species, you don't just say the species. I warned everyone yesterday, you have to, sorry, I warned everybody when you took the exam. You don't just say the species, you have to make it into a full sentence. Also, tertiary consumer is kind of tricky. A lot of you count up 3, but the bottom is a producer. So the second is the first consumer. The second consumer is a carnivore. It eats first consumers. And tertiary consumer would be the 4th level, something which eats primary and secondary consumers. Tertiary consumer is the 4th trophic level. A little bit of confusion about that, not horrible. Almost everybody saw competition in the food web. Very few students failed to get that one. In number B, most students did well, except for the conceptual thing. Kids still say this, and you got to be careful. Producers don't grow for the sake of the things that eat them. I see this all the time. Plants make sugar for themselves, not to feed vegetarian animals. In C, most of you saw direct effects, like when you remove a species, there's less food for this one and more of these left around. Most of you saw the direct effects, but don't go further, because when you start to make crazy predictions, like these are going to get hungry, so they're going to evolve to change their time of day so that they can get a longer beak to get a different kind of food, like, bro, that's not a direct effect. And a lot of that is sort of tough to predict. You know, if ecosystems were that simple, we would mess with them more. But if there's one thing I want to convince you of, is that ecosystems are actually really complex. And so we can't usually predict more than the most direct effects. And even those, we make mistakes sometimes. In number D, almost everybody got it right, which is encouraging because it shows you understand the rule of 70, except a bunch of you didn't get credit because you didn't show your work. That's frustrating because I know you did it right, but there's these formatting issues like the full sentences and like showing your work. That's why it's in the instructions on the exam. There's no exceptions to this rule because you gotta read the instructions. It's like putting your name on the paper. When it says show your work, you gotta show your work. When it says full sentences, you gotta use full sentences. It's kind of heartbreaking to take away those points. Luckily, most of you did pretty well. I'm not that worried about it. In the multiple choice, you know, there's always a few questions that are kind of like, whoa, I guess that's tricky, but nothing that was really bad. Like if a quarter of you get the questions wrong, that's kind of, you know, a mixture of mistake, oversight, pressing the wrong button. I'm not that worried. 30-40% of kids get a question wrong. That's like, yeah, that might have been tricky wording. Maybe there's a language issue. 50-60% of kids get a question wrong. I'm like making notes like, yo, I got to teach this better next time. And if any questions are like 80 or 90% wrong, I'm like, that's not the kid's fault. I did something wrong. Overall, there were no really, really bad questions and only a few that were, you know, we should talk about it more. Here's the list. I think that all of these things were in the course, but they were probably too small of a detail, this should remind you to take detailed notes. Phosphorus has no gas form. It's often a limiting factor because it's only available when water's moving phosphorus around. That means, if the water doesn't reach the plant, then that could limit the growth of the plant. That's what limiting factors are. Linking a vocabulary word in a tricky concept, that does usually exclude some students. I would have expected 30, 40 to get that wrong. It was like 50, 60% got that one wrong. The deer always tricks my students, and I think I'm okay with students getting this one wrong because it's a clear example. You could be a low trophic level and be large. Deer eat grass, so they're a primary consumer. A spider is tiny, but it's in a higher trophic level because it eats other stuff that eats producers. So a spider is in a higher trophic level than a deer, and students' minds are blown, but it's just about understanding what eats what, how you label parts of a food chain. Carbon sinks continue to be a tricky concept year after year. I don't seem to have a way to explain this right. It's where elements are taken out of the biosphere. It's where they go out of play. Like a manhole cover that is out of the way. Soccer ball falls through a manhole cover and now you can't play anymore. That would be a sink because that soccer ball is now in a place where you can't reach it anymore. It's a sink. So carbon sinks are places where carbon leaves. If you exhale, carbon's still in play because a plant could use that. And if a plant takes carbon out of the air and makes a sugar, that's in play because you could eat that plant. Those are still in the biosphere. In the atmosphere, they can go to the biosphere. If there's carbonate in water, that carbonate can get back into life. But sinks are places where carbon leaves, like sediment, deep sediments in the bottom of the ocean, and soil in a forest. Calcium carbonate is the shell of corals and crabs and humans. It's our bones. And so calcium carbonate, because it's kind of heavy, can often sink. In that format, it can dissolve back into the biosphere, but it can also just get covered up in the bottom of the ocean, and that's a common way that carbon sinks. Everybody always gets nitrification and denitrification wrong. It's not really your fault. They're tricky words. You can only be expected to remember so much. I'm not too worried. I knew that kids would not do well with that question. Again, I'm overall really encouraged. To be honest, last semester was much worse and I was not encouraged. I was discouraged. I was scared. This class is doing fine. This term is doing really well. I want to remind you, exams are not the biggest part of your grade. It feels like it, but nobody ever misses them unless they're really blowing it. Unless you ditch on an exam or you cheat on an exam, you're always going to have a score. You'll never have a 0. Just don't cheat, just don't ditch, and you'll never have a 0. Right? So exam averages tend to be much higher than you think. Even if you do badly, bad grades are still better than 50% or so, especially if you do the corrections. And most of you will have a couple of exams where you nail it. So by the time you get to the end of the semester, exam averages are not the weakness that sinks your battleship. They really aren't. Even if you do horribly on exam, you just do the corrections, you're never going to miss one, you'll be all right. The place where I really do see kids' grades tanking in a way that they can't catch up is missing homework deadlines. I need you to be ready for class. You got to get the homework deadlines. And you got to do all the warm-ups and activities because those are not a lot of points, so missing a few has a big impact. In the long term, your grade's going to do this. but I really wouldn't stress too much about the exams. Our curves are a little bit less forgiving than the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 at the College Board. So don't worry, there's a lot of room to grow in the exams. Just do the corrections. And really, if you're worried about your grade, don't mess around with the homework. Don't mess around with the classwork stuff. That's the big stuff. The exams, you could do badly. It's just to give you feedback. You'll have the correction option, earn back half of your lost points. All right. I assume that there's a lot to talk about. So I'd like you to take a second, write down all your questions, and then we'll go back to class so that we can talk and you can ask me all your questions, okay? Overall, very good job. I'm really encouraged.